Right. Okay, well, I think we'll start now. I think maybe some more people will be joining us, but let's begin. So first of all, good evening, and thank you very much to everybody for joining us for this special Women in Journalism event on the eve of International Women's Day. My name is Alison Phillips, and I'm the current chair of Women in Journalism in the UK. And for those of you, who haven't come across Women in Journalism before, we're a club representing around 1,000 women journalists in this country, which works to support, inspire, and promote each other's work. But we also believe very strongly that we have a role in doing those same things with our colleagues around the globe too. And that's why we felt very strongly that we wanted to do something on International Women's Day in solidarity and support for those women journalists still working in Afghanistan, or those who've had to flee the country since the Taliban swept to power last summer. As you may know, this event was initially intended to be an in-person fundraiser, but our three speakers for that event, Yalda Hakim from the BBC, who also runs the Yalda Hakim Foundation, has helped create this event, along with Sky News' Alex Crawford and the Sunday Times' Christina Lamb, have now all been sent out to report on the Ukraine crisis. And of course, tonight we keep all those suffering in the most unimaginable way in Ukraine in our thoughts. And we think too of all those journalists who are quite heroically putting their own lives at risk to tell the truth from Ukraine. I mean, rarely have there been many examples, as we've seen in recent weeks, about the importance of journalism reporting the truth, in contrast to a society which is closing down free speech, closing down journalism, as we now see in Russia. And Yalda Hakim will be joining us from where she's been working in Lviv later on this evening. But tonight, we particularly want to remember those women who have tried to tell their truths in Afghanistan. In 2020, there were 700 women journalists working in the country. A report at the end of last year showed that that number is now down to fewer than 40. Many have fled into exile, and tonight we are hugely honoured to be joined by one of them, Zahra Joya, who is the founder of Rukshana Media, a women's media organisation in Afghanistan, and also Rukshana, who is now, just in the last few weeks, become one of Time Magazine's 12 Women of the Year, so a true inspiration to us all. Also during the evening, we're going to hear some letters written for us by women who are still in Afghanistan, who stayed there, but unable to tell their own stories or join us because of the restrictions they live under each day. And their words are going to be read instead by some of the UK's leading journalists and presenters. But to begin with, we're going to start by watching a short film, which Janelle, my deputy in Women in Journalism, is going to show. So here we go, let's watch the film.
For 100,000 people fled. تشویش داریم اما چاره چی است؟ تا کی فرار کنیم و تا کی پنهان شویم؟ Now, with access to the new Taliban government, I want to find out what the country is like under their rule.
وخت راغلی او دلته یو نظام تللی دی یو اداره تللی ده بل نظام راغلی دی مابینسته.
They face a country shattered by war.
مردم دیدن که اونا سر ما بم میاندازن ما را میکشن. مقاومت شروع کرد. همش.
The economy is close to collapse, and millions face starvation. Every baby and child in here is in a critical state, so we just don't know if they're going to make it. Poverty and hunger is now affecting nearly everyone in Afghanistan. There is an increasing concern that terrorist groups are using this to recruit and to challenge the newfound authority of the Taliban. ISIS in Khorasan, also known as ISIS-K, are the regional affiliate of the Islamic State. During the Taliban takeover, thousands of ISIS militants escaped from jail, swelling the ranks of the terror group.
Afghanistan's winter chill has brought fresh levels of suffering to a people who've endured decades of it. And in one of the poorest countries, its poorest region may well be the birthplace of the world's largest humanitarian disaster. A measles outbreak is ripping through them. In the tiny, with already poor immunity, measles can be a death sentence. The insecurities meant vaccines hadn't been given. And there are widespread claims it's the Taliban who prevented them. We're being taken down Afghanistan's back streets to avoid the Taliban's many armed checkpoints. Escorting us is the leader of the most unlikely and bravest of rebels. They've already moved once after Taliban fighters ordered them to shut down. Because these rebels are girls and they're in a banned art class, and no Taliban threats will deter them, not even in midwinter with no heating.
I went back after 9/11, after the Taliban had fallen, and like many journalists, went to the border town of Quetta in Pakistan. And one night, a friend of mine, an old Afghan friend, came to me with a letter. I had asked him if he could find an Afghan woman living in Kabul under the Taliban who would write to me about what life was like. And so he came to me, I was surprised that he managed to do it, with these sheets torn from an exercise book. She wrote, "In our house behind the burqas that we must now wear is a red silk party dress, my mother's from the time of the king, at the time when my father worked in the foreign ministry. Sometimes I hold it up against me and imagine dancing, but it's a lost world. We have small rebellions, my sister and I. We run secret English and science classes, and we have a red lipstick." She ended by saying, "It's funny, we live under the same small sky, but it's as if we are 500 years behind. I do not know what you want me to write to you. Maybe our worlds will always be too far apart." Reading Murray's words made me realize something. When we report on war, we often forget that it's the women that are the real heroes. Even as a female journalist, I know that many of the women I've written about as victims, weeping over the broken bodies of their sons or husbands, or women who have been raped by enemy soldiers. And yet it's the women who have to protect and educate their children, feed them, pass under sniper fire to collect food, and if things get too bad, take them over dangerous journeys to other countries to seek refuge.
So I think there's some fantastic words there. I think there's a great line Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times said in the final bit of that video, where she said, "Women so often are the real heroes," and that can quite often be forgotten. And I think tonight we're remembering the women who are the real heroes through their journalism as well. And throughout this evening, we want to remember those journalists who aren't here themselves to tell their story. So we're going to begin by hearing from one of those journalists in her own words, and the words are going to be written this evening by Saira Khan, television presenter and journalist as well. So Saira, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I really hope I can get through this letter without tears, but it's really very emotional. This letter is written by Farzana Sadat. She comes from a media organisation, Dinesh Radio and Television, in the Parvan province, and her position was reporter and presenter. Her experience in journalism has been for 4 years, and she writes, "I've been working with the media for the past 4 years, but unfortunately, with the advent of the Taliban regime, my media activities were limited. I have been living in uncertainty since then. I remained in office until 15 years after the Taliban I have remained in office until 15 days after the Taliban takeover. The Taliban, in order to show the world that they have changed and have no problem with women, told my manager that I and a few other women should continue to work. Then after a while, the manager told me that I was no longer allowed to work because the Taliban say no. Now it has been more than 6 months now, and I have not been able to find any job because I am a woman. From the Taliban point of view, I have to stay at home and take care of the house. Unfortunately, the Taliban do not understand our economic situation at all. The media community in Afghanistan faces a variety of challenges, financial problems and death threats are two challenges that journalists, particularly female journalists, have faced. The Taliban's enmity with freedom of expression is deeply rooted. The group does not even know anything about freedom of expression, let alone respect for freedom of expression. We call on the international community and the international media to not forget the members of the media in Afghanistan. The option to go on the road and demand our rights from the Taliban government is off the table. It is impossible. I am very scared of suffering the fate of Tamara Pariani, and I have been complaining about international organizations that claim to support journalists. The silence of the United Nations, the European Union, and other organizations is really annoying. How long will they watch us in this state of injustice, uncertainty, and homelessness without doing anything? I moved to another home after Taliban government because I did not feel safe. Now, due to unemployment, my economic situation is so bad that I cannot afford to pay the rent. I cannot afford my dinner, and I do not have a child to sell like hundreds of other families. So I can buy a loaf of bread for my family. I hope the world will break its silence and take serious action to protect the media and the safety of journalists, particularly female journalists in Afghanistan. Please continue to advocate for us.
Thank you so much for reading that, Saira, and thank you for sharing. I mean, it's just incredibly difficult to hear what women are having to cope with on a daily basis. So thank you very much for sharing that letter with us. And now we're going to go to Zahra Joya, the founder of Rukhsana Media, who's since moved to London. And Zahra, I think you want to start by reading a piece, don't you? And then maybe, I know you don't feel hugely confident in your English, but I'm sure you'll be fantastic. And then if people have got questions for Zahra, they can either pop them in the chat or we can just talk at the end. So now over to you, Zahra.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It is my honor to be here with you. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone. I'm apologize because my English is not good enough. So I wrote my speech and I will read for you. I'm glad today to reflect one of the most pressing humanitarian situation going in my country, Afghanistan. We are celebrating the International Women's Solidarity Day at a critical time when half of the population of Afghanistan women are being victimized by the Taliban's barbaric violence. Taliban's role has reduced the value of women's life to their bodies and sexual organs. The group has imposed strict restriction on women's personal and social life. On this day, we need to ask, how can we work to prevent and end the sexual apartheid in Afghanistan? In the last 6 months since the Taliban took over, most of Afghan women have been placed under house arrest. Many of the brave women have taken to the street continuously over the past 6 months, chanting slowing of bread, work, and freedom against the Taliban's restrictive policies. In response, the Taliban have unprecedentedly increased violence against women by detaining dozens of women protesters from their homes while forcing them to record videos of imposed confession that could be used for propaganda. It is nice if in this day we talk about the history of women's struggle across the world, but we can't ignore all the operations they have gone through. In my country, Afghanistan, life for women is like a hill. Women are depriving of their basic human rights, and the Taliban have severely restricted them to express their opinion. Under the Taliban, women have lost their job, social participation, and public identity. violence against the strictly increased both at home and society. I'm speaking to you here as a woman journalist. Although it has never been easy to be a woman and be a journalist in Afghanistan, it is now much more difficult to have been even an ordinary woman in Afghanistan. Being a journalist is a far-reaching wish. Or there are very few female journalists remaining in the country. Taliban have forced them to wear hijab, while banning them from appearing on film and raising their voice on radio in some provinces. In our small newsroom at Rukhshana Media, we usually listen to the women who are telling their horrible stories while crying. When they talk about their lost dreams, they break their threads. They look to the past, to years of striving for dreams, for change to be the most basic human rights and a future that is no more there. These women starting their struggle for their rights and social status from their home and family and tried to expand it to schools, university, and withdraw society. But all of that vanished overnight when the Taliban came back. Afghan women have voiced their dissatisfactions to the world. They have repeatedly questioned the world's silence on the Taliban crimes against women. But last but not the least, I, on behalf of all my Afghan sisters and Afghan women, express my message to solidarity of the people of Ukraine, especially the women who have been displaced like us and are going through a tragic time in their history. I'm very thankful for all of you to providing me this opportunity to convey the message of Afghan women who have been brutalized by the Taliban's injustice rule in the past 6 months. Once again, happy Age of March to all of women in the world. Let's stay from behind the resilient women in Afghanistan, especially women and journalists. Thank you so much for your time.
Zahra, thank you so much for your time. You've been hugely inspirational, I think, in all the work you've done, and it was fantastic that Time magazine has recognised you in the last few weeks. You're now living in London?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm living in London.
And is your family here, or is your family still in Afghanistan?
Unfortunately, my parents, they are in Afghanistan.
That must be very hard for you.
Yeah, of course, yes.
And have you made friends and new colleagues in London?
Yes, I have some new friends in London.
Yeah, and do you still try to do journalism in London then? So you're working in London still?
I'm working from my own room, yes.
Yeah, and still writing about Afghanistan, so people happening.
Yes.
Yeah. And how do you feel, how do you feel we as women journalists in the UK, what can we do to help? What can we, is there anything we can do to help?
Honestly, it's a very hard and difficult time for Afghan women journalists. Right now, the most of them, they are in hiding, and they need to get out from Afghanistan. If is it possible, you can find a way for the person who are in high risk in Afghanistan, and you can get out them from Afghanistan. So the other side, I think the more than 18% of the women journalists, they are disappearing from the media outlets in Afghanistan. So I think it is very important to talk with the Taliban as a women journalist, to let all of female journalists to work as a journalist in Afghanistan. So because you know, I know there is nothing different between women society. All of them of the same. All of women are banned from working, from educations and from work.
Yes.
So yeah, but the women, the presence of the women in the media outlets is very important, especially in this crisis situations.
And what do you think the future holds for women in Afghanistan?
Right now, you know, the time is very difficult, and we can't think about the futures honestly, because right now we are facing to more challenge we should solve the first. So right now, you know, freedom expression is under attack, and access to information is very limited by the Taliban. And the other side, all of female journalists, they are afraid from the Taliban attack, and
Yes, and so at the moment it's just really focusing on trying to keep people safe, really, more than anything else.
Yes, you're exactly right. Now all of the female journalists, they are just trying to be safe, trying to just staying home, and unfortunately.
At the beginning we said that there had been 700 women journalists in Afghanistan, and now we believe there is fewer than 40 working in the country. How many do you think left Afghanistan, and how many are now in hiding?
I think I don't have a specific number of this journalism, but according to the Human Watch report today, they published one report. They according to this report, the women journalists are facing to more challenge, and they are facing to more limitations because of the Taliban. So it's not clear, honestly, to how many female journalists get out from Afghanistan and how many are in hiding. But one of thing is very clear, that the most of the journalists, female journalists, they didn't work no longer in Afghanistan.
And then of the journalists that you know that have come to London or gone to America or Canada, have they been able to find work? Have they been able to find jobs?
I hope they can find their jobs, because you know, being a refugee, honestly, it was not on our own hands. It was not our choice.
No.
So and all of us, we forced to leave our country, to flee from our country. So as I know, my friend, they left their jobs as a journalist. They left their jobs to work as a journalist. So right now, unfortunately, they don't have this opportunity.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for being with us this evening. And I know we're joined by other people, other women who were working in Afghanistan, who are also on this call. So thank you very much, and please stay with us.
Thank you.
And now we're going, thank you very much, Zahra, it's great. And so now we're going to hear another letter from, as we were discussing, one of the women that is still living in Afghanistan, who is still, who's no longer able to work there, but who is still there. And this letter is going to be read by Emily Maitlis from Newsnight. Oh, sorry.
Letter from Bahira Naziri, who was a journalist at Kawa Radio and Television. Like hundreds of other reporters, recent abnormal developments in the country have badly transformed my life. I fought with many challenges to work in the media. I went through many challenges to serve my dear family. But these 6 months abnormal developments in the country have closed the door of the media to me and others like me. It wasn't long after the Taliban ruled that Kawa Radio and Television announced to all female employees that women could no longer continue to work. We wanted to complain about this, but they showed us a secret notification letter from the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, which had instructed the media that they were no longer allowed to employ women in their programmes. 6 months ago, the management of the TV station fired me and others without paying my salary. For 6 months, they brutally took away our freedom of speech, silencing our voices forever. The main problem that I and most female journalists face is our financial problems and our security. I was the only one who was supporting my family financially. With the loss of my job, there is no longer any income source for the family. While working in the media, I was very proud of myself and always felt that I was the eyes and ears of my own people. Why is the international community indifferent to media censorship and the situation of Afghan journalists, especially female journalists? Was freedom of speech and media only important when the United States was in Afghanistan? Why those who responded to our slightest protest before the abnormal developments are now silent and just watching us? As a reporter to the international community, I want to say that I and hundreds of other female reporters are now experiencing gradual death. Although we are currently free and not in the Taliban's prisons, we are experiencing the worst kind of imprisonment in our homes. We see every day the destruction of the media, the destruction of civil society activists, even the destruction of our families because of poverty every day.
Oh, lovely. And that was read by the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire. And I think there's a common theme appearing in the letters that we're hearing today, which is very much that the women who are still in Afghanistan really want us here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe and America to not forget about them and to ensure that the story that got so much coverage last summer continues to get coverage now, so that these people aren't forgotten. And we now move to one more letter, which is now going to be read, which is read by Cathy Newman.
This is from Lena Nazir, a producer and presenter at Education TV and Radio, the Afghan Ministry of Education's radio and TV platform. The fall of the Afghan government and the occupation of Afghanistan by the Taliban was painful for me and my daughter. I live in hiding with my daughter in Kabul. After the Taliban took over, my problems have increased manyfold. Sometimes it's very difficult for me to bear these problems and I do not know how to overcome all of it. I was threatened by my husband and his family because they did not want me to work with the media. Therefore, I separated from my husband and his family and had to flee with my 1-year-old daughter to an unknown location in Kabul. I had a normal life when I had a job, despite all the problems. But after the Taliban took over and since the media organization I worked with is owned by the government, I was fired. And so now I do not have any income. I secretly work as a labourer. Sometimes I cannot even afford to buy milk for my daughter. And when I look at my daughter and think about her future, living a miserable life as I do in this country, it makes me sad. In the last 7 months, the situation has become so heavy for me that I even have thoughts of ending my life and my child's life. Hundreds of media outlets have been shut down since the Taliban came to power, and hundreds of male and female journalists are facing countless problems. I call on all the aid agencies to save the journalists and hundreds of others from this situation. Male journalists are better off than female reporters because they are able to at least work as a labourer and to be able to find at least one meal a day. But women are not even allowed to go out without a male chaperone, let alone find a job. I have no man as a mahram, a male chaperone to accompany me outside home, and life has become very difficult for me. Dozens of journalists have disappeared, and women have been silenced. Women have not been able to work with the media. Women are not allowed to attend a Taliban press conference. Hundreds of female journalists are now unemployed in Kabul and the provinces. Organizations who are supposed to support journalists have a good, close relationship with the Taliban. And if journalists protest, they are identified by them and then silenced. Our hearts are broken. We have no hope for the future under this regime. We ask the international media to raise our voices because we are silenced. Please do not forget us.
And thank you very much to Cathy for reading that one. I just think that's such a poignant plea. Please do not forget us. And that's what we're trying to do this evening, is to not forget. But I think we all need to think when we leave here this evening about what more we need to do to ensure that that these stories are remembered. And now we're joined by Yalda Hakim, who's done so much work to ensure that women in Afghanistan are not being forgotten. So Yalda, are you there?
I am. Hi, Alison.
Hello, Yalda. How are you? And you're joining us from Lviv, is that correct?
Yes, I am. I'm in Western Ukraine.
Okay, so let's before we talk about Afghanistan. I mean, obviously, you know, the world's attention has moved to Ukraine in the last couple of weeks, and it's so important to remember Afghanistan as well, and that it's sort of that we don't move on from one global crisis to the next. But tell us, how have you found the refugee situation since you've been in Lviv?
Well, you know, Alison, Lviv really has become a hub for the refugees looking for some kind of safety from the ongoing shellings and bombardment every single day. And I think one thing that's been quite striking, quite heartbreaking, is the number of women and children who are fleeing on their own. I was on the Poland-Ukraine border, and I was seeing all these young children saying goodbye to their fathers. Heartbreaking scenes where, you know, fathers were hanging on to bits of toys that their children had left behind, saying their final goodbyes, uncertain about when they'll meet again, if they'll meet again. One teenage boy said to me, "I hope my father stays alive." And one father was on his mobile phone, you know, the whole time speaking to his wife, the children weeping as they walked away and queued up to cross that border. So it's been tough. It's been tough to see these stories. You know, and the sea of just small babies and children. 500,000 children have been displaced in this conflict already. And I was at Lviv train station yesterday, and same scenes. I mean, you know, mothers breastfeeding on sides of streets and just with a small suitcase, because they said, we never thought this would happen. 12 days ago, we never thought that this would actually hit and strike, and that we would be shelled in this way. They've spent days in bunkers without any food, water, heating. At times it gets to -7, -8 degrees. It's freezing. I'm spending days doing lives, you know, outside in the cold, and I have you know, they've now got a hot water bottle for me as well, so that I can keep warm, and I have warm clothes. But I can't imagine sleeping in a bunker for 10, 12 days with very small children, trying to keep them alive, and the fear that they have, these children. I was speaking to a mother today who has a 7-year-old, and she said the things her eyes have seen, I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to erase those. So, but these are the lucky ones, the ones who have come to Western Ukraine, because Ukraine isn't experiencing the bombardment, although we are getting a security briefing this evening. So I'm hoping everything is okay, but I'm being summoned shortly. So I would love to talk about Afghanistan shortly too.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you. So tell us, for those people on this call that don't know, so you have set up the Yalda Hakim Foundation. So talk to us about how you your involvement with Afghanistan.
So I was born in Afghanistan. It's the country of my birth. So what happened felt quite personal. In many ways, personally, it was one of the most difficult things 6 months ago when the when Kabul collapsed and the Taliban took over, because you could see and feel the progress that had been made sort of crumbling. And of course, it wasn't perfect. There were so many issues already, the high levels of corruption. There are whole villages that never had a school, not 20 years ago, not now, not 40 years ago. And these are cultural issues that need to be dealt with. But for me to go back to Kabul in December and see hardly any women in the streets, and they were reeling as they were locked up in their homes. And you heard there the stories of those journalists who spoke about becoming completely, almost pushed out of public life, not even on the periphery, just completely silenced and disappeared. And then, of course, the female activists, the journalists, the civil society, people on the run. But the only thing that gives me hope is that these activists, these journalists, these women who remain and continue to stare down the barrel of a gun, fighting for their freedom. And I think I've been asked a number of times about the similarities between Afghanistan and Ukraine. And the one thing that comes to mind is the horrors of war, the tragedy of war, but also no one has a monopoly on freedom. No one has a monopoly on civilization. And you realize in these circumstances that 1 minute your life can be normal, and the next minute you're facing absolute pure horror. And that is, I suppose, what is a reminder, but also the human spirit, how resilient these people are, how resilient these women are in these societies. I mean, the women here in Ukraine scooping up their children and trying to do whatever they can, risking their own lives to get them to safety. The women in Afghanistan doing what they can every single day to speak up, despite facing, detention by the Taliban, torture at times, intimidation. So my foundation focuses on education mainly, and we have scholarships in the UK at Oxford University. We have scholarships in Doha at Georgetown University, and we've also just set up 120 scholarships for those young students who have been evacuated from Afghanistan in the United States. So we're working with the Big Ten in the United States, the universities, and we've set up these scholarships. But we've also gone into absolute sort of humanitarian assistance as well in Afghanistan, where we're working with various NGOs and local partners to deal with the famine. Because, of course, it is no exaggeration when they say it's a march towards starvation. I have not seen in my 15 years of coverage of the country the kind of famine, the kind of starvation, hospital after hospital, ward after ward. I have a 2.5-year-old, and when he has a cold, I completely panic. I'm up all night. I'm trying to deal with it, and these mothers are dealing with children who are suffering from malnutrition, and sometimes they're told that they're not sure if the child is going to make it. And so to see these mothers in these wards that are completely overcrowded, and the hospital staff are absolute heroes because they come into work day in, day out without being paid any kind of salary. They haven't been paid a salary for months. Imagine not getting your salary for a week. We wouldn't go into work, let alone for 5 or 6 months, going in every day and not sure where you're going to get your own next meal from, let alone going into a hospital, cleaning it to ensure that the child and the baby doesn't die, going there and treating the children to make sure that the children don't die. So the foundation has now gone into humanitarian work virtually. So it was based on education, educating Afghan girls and women who had the talent but not the means, and we would give them full scholarships. And now we've gone into humanitarian work, and it has no overheads. So that's something that I feel really proud about, that everyone is a volunteer. Every cent that comes in goes directly to people and goes directly to the needy. And we've helped a handful of people get through winter this winter by helping them with firewood and rice and wheat and heating and whatever support we can, and on our own small scale we've been able to do what we can.
It's incredible what you have. It's incredible what you've done, and some of the reports that we've seen from yourself as well and elsewhere over the past few months, particularly with the cold in the winter, have been absolutely harrowing to watch, and the desperate measures that some families have had to go to survive. I mean, when you meet these people, you meet these families, I mean, do you have any hope that things are gonna, or do they have any hope that things are going to improve, or is this their future?
You know, it's again similarities with Ukraine. When you fight for your country, and when you fight for your own freedom, someone can come and crush you with guns and missiles, but they can't take away your own belief in your freedom. And these female journalists that we've been hearing from, they have fear, but something always rises from the ashes. You cannot impose your will, your ideology on a people, on 40 million people. And at some point, people rise and they demand change, and they demand accountability. And whether that's an authoritarian regime, it might last 10 years, it might last 20 years, it might last 50 years. In some cases, it can last 100 years. But ultimately, people do speak up. Who would have thought that in Russia, 4,000 people would get detained within the space of 24 hours because they're protesting against this war? Who would have thought a week ago that the might of the Russian army would struggle in this country, because people, 18-year-old students, 20-year-old students, are picking up guns and going to the front line? Who would have thought that in the space of 6 months that the Taliban have taken over, they're feeling the pressure of the international community and opening up universities for women? You know, 20 years ago, when the Taliban were in power, there is no way in hell that some of the things that we're seeing in the country today would have happened, because women were silenced. Women were in hiding. Women lived in fear. They would amputate, you know, hands and feet publicly. They had public beheadings and public stonings. You're not seeing that publicly in Afghanistan. I'm sure it is happening, and it is happening. The Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have been documenting these atrocities. Journalists have been documenting the atrocities. So these things are happening, but not on a large public scale that we expected and anticipated. That means that something has shifted, and they know that if they are to survive, they need to bend to the will of the people. And this is now a different people from 20 years ago. They've tasted 20 years of freedom. This is now a youth and a generation who are going to say, okay, just as these women, I will get shot dead, but I'm not going to stop speaking up.
And what is the role of the media in that? I mean, there's so much you talk about, you know, in Afghanistan, the 20 years of freedom, and a lot of that was a freer media. And again, in you know, we've been talking as well about in Russia, where now we're seeing the media is being closed down even more oppressively in the last few days. What is the role of the media in these situations, and particularly of women in the media?
Well, so critical, right? As women, we know that when we go to certain parts of the world, we have more access to people than our male counterparts. I often get asked, you know, you work in the Middle East, you work in these dangerous places. How difficult is it as a woman? And I say, actually, I use it to my benefit, because I get access to women that men in many societies don't. And it's these courageous women who have been trained, who have worked as part of the thriving media of the last 20 years, who want to continue to work. One of the first interviews with the Taliban was with a female presenter. Now, she was intimidated and then forced out of the country, and she's had to leave, and she's now in Albania. But the fact is that, again, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. These women are being intimidated. The press is being intimidated. There is a crackdown. There are all sorts of strange media laws that are being put in place that they make announcements through the Ministry of Vice and Virtue that women can't appear on the screen. And yet, I mean, if you look at Tolo TV, for example, there are female journalists out on the street reporting, asking tough questions, interviewing the Taliban, albeit under sort of a sense of, you know, self-censoring, but they're still doing it. And so they need our support more than ever, because, you know, these are part of our fraternity. They are part of our global community. And when we fly into these countries, it is these journalists who ensure that we have the right people that we want to interview, that we hold the right people accountable. They are the backbone of our storytelling, and they have been for the last 20 years. So more than ever, they now need us not to look away, for it to not be too hard to deal with, for it not to be some faraway place that we just, you know, don't want to deal with. Our troops are no longer there. Our embassies are no longer there. We no longer have a presence there. Therefore, we should not care. We've trained them. We've inspired them. We've funded them. And then we abandoned them. And so that's something that we as journalists, certainly female journalists, should not do to the women journalists in Afghanistan.
And do you worry, I mean, I know you've got to go shortly, but do you worry that with the Ukraine crisis that maybe even more attention may slip away from Afghanistan and it could get forgotten?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, even before the Ukraine crisis, there was a level of fatigue that we'd covered the people falling out of the sky and you know, the drama at the airport and some of the sexier elements of the takeover of the Taliban, the insurgency and the oppression of women, and then we moved on. And so, you know, I think increasingly, and certainly it was a lesson for me, because as a journalist, I work in the news department, but I also work in film and current affairs. And I think I've just realized that, you know, the news cycle means that we move away from the headlines, you know, pretty much straight away. Once it's, you know, the public have lost interest, we sort of move our attention elsewhere. And I've tried every single day for 6 or 7 months. I have every day on my show talked about Afghanistan, even if it's been a 1-minute rant, just to draw attention to the situation. And in the last maybe 3-4 weeks, I haven't been able to, because of course the crisis in Ukraine, the horror of war that we're seeing here, the horrific images of mothers being shot dead, facing shelling, you know, trying to carry their prams out of an area where they're being bombed and shelled, that has dominated the headlines, and so it should. But equally, we should not look away from, you know, the other horrors in the world, because there are certainly many of them. But the one thing that gives me hope is that sadly, you know, this is the nature of history. It doesn't repeat itself, but, you know, we often say it rhymes. And this is the tragedy of the human spirit. And, you know, these things happen, and yet the refugees you're seeing, the Afghan refugees that have left the country, over 100,000 or more of them now, you know, will take the opportunities they're given with both hands and make something of it. My parents did, and you know, I feel very proud about, you know, where they are now today and what we were able to do as a family. And I know dozens, hundreds, millions of immigrant families who have done the same. The Ukrainians will do the same, and they will get their country back, as will the Afghans.
And I've got one final question from Bethany Laley, who I think probably asked the question that we're all thinking this evening. She says, I'm a 16-year-old student in England. What can I do to help? What can we all do to help the women in Afghanistan?
Well, you know, this event was initially supposed to be in person, and I'm so sorry to everyone that we weren't able to do that, because obviously the crisis in Ukraine, and Alex, myself, Christina, we all had to sort of jet away in the nature of our job. But I'm so grateful to the women in journalism for reaching out and saying, what can we do to help Afghan women and Afghan female journalists? And so we collaborated and we wanted to put this event together because we didn't want Afghan women and Afghan female journalists to be forgotten. And so I have a small foundation. I'd love for you to dig deep where you can, whatever you can, to assist. The funds will go directly to the female journalists that you've heard from tonight, and other projects to support them, to ensure that they get through the winter, to ensure that their families are supported, because of course they no longer have work. They no longer have the level of support they need. And so, but there are other ways of helping, whether you want to stay connected with some of these journalists, offer some kind of level of mentorship in your newsrooms, take their stories and highlight them where you can in your newsrooms. So it's about being able to give a donation, but it's also about being creative where you can. And if it's, you know, taking some of these letters read tonight and seeing if you can publish them somewhere in your newsrooms, or other stories that these women publish, and perhaps that's a way of supporting them financially as well. But their stories should not be forgotten, and the world should not look away.
Thank you so much, Yalda, and thank you so much for joining us. And look after yourself and stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hosting the event.
Not at all, not at all. And then we're drawing to a close now, everybody. But finally, we're going to have one final letter written from a journalist who is still in Afghanistan. And this letter is going to be read for us by Newsnight's Emily Maitlis.
What she wrote. First of all, let me thank you for giving us, the ones who do not have a stage to speak, and the ones who've been oppressed, the opportunity to speak. You're hearing words of a letter from an Afghan female journalist, a woman who was born in the midst of smoke, gunpowder and war, a child who grew up and got educated and now, with the end of war, works to fight tyranny and discrimination, a woman who struggles to fight all kinds of oppression of individual rights and freedoms. Afghan women have undoubtedly been the most oppressed and vulnerable women in history. The reason we're here, the current restrictions on women, is because of patriarchal traditions in Afghan society. We thought we were moving towards some positive change. However, after the Taliban occupation of Afghanistan now, there are no traces of those small hopes left for the women of my country. They all perished. Do you know, I feel sad and I feel sorry. I feel sorry for myself, my generation, my fellow women, because my generation is now doomed to silence. My generation.
Oh, I think we may have lost the sound on Emily there. Should we give it one more moment? No, I think we may have unfortunately lost the sound on Emily Maitlis there. But what we can do is that we will be putting this all on the Women in Journalism website very soon, probably tomorrow or later in the week. So if you want to listen back to all the readings this evening and to that final one again, we'll be able to do that now. So really, it's just left to me to thank you all so much for coming along and joining us. Hopefully we will do an in-person event later in the year, so we may actually be able to meet face to face. Thank you so much for all the women journalists from Afghanistan who've joined us this evening, to Newsworks who've helped sponsor the event, the University of Westminster who were going to host the event had we done it in permanent, in person, and finally the Yalda Hakim Foundation. Now there's a link in the chat if you'd like to donate to the foundation to help women across Afghanistan who are struggling at this current time, and if we can just all really try to think what else we can do, as Yalda said, creatively. We are journalists. What can we do journalistically to make sure that these voices are heard and these stories are told, because that is a very powerful way that we can all help. So finally, thank you all so much for coming along. Good evening, and I hope you have a very challenging, enjoyable and productive International Women's Day. Thank you very much. Good night.